Hi, I'm Brendan Baker, aka BB Miniatures, and welcome to my latest video. I've been very lucky to have Games Workshop send me a new box set of the Tomb Kings from the re-release, Returning to the Old World of Warhammer Fantasy. I knew my patience would pay off someday as this classic has returned with an updated rule set and awaiting a new coat of paint. Literally. Back when I was around 1920, geez, like close to 20 years now, my most memorable army I played were the Tomb Kings. It all comes back to my fascination of ancient Egypt with their numerous gods and unique style as a culture. But now I'm back and determined to paint up a force and also to return with some close friends to take back on the battlefield. Armed with a whole lot of new hobby knowledge and experience, I'll be sharing with you my methods on how I'll make these ranks of skeletons look awesome to take to the field and be a proud owner of a very impressive and immersive army. For materials, I'll be utilizing the airbrush as well as enamel washes that need thinners in order to dilute the paint. I highly recommend using these materials in a well ventilated area and wear a respirator with the right filters applied. A hairdryer is also handy for the hobbyists who wish to help speed up the drying process, but otherwise a wet palette, some metal saucers for making washes, and pigments are also handy to keep the process smooth. Before we get started, let's just take a quick look at a completed single skeleton warrior and make a few notes on what I want to achieve. First off is the color palette. When looking at the Tomb King's art, it's good to notice that the combination of the desert sand and the scorched sun as we get a lot warmer tones of ochres, umbers, and oxides. This trio are all fairly desaturated with no pure colors, but in the contrast spot color we have that is that Khemri royal blue. This main color of the forest not only stands out really nicely, but also decorates their shields, which take up a large area of the model. It's for this reason that in order to make an army stand out on the battlefield, I'll be putting a little extra time into making these look great. It's this and the gold that are the main elements on the model that'll get the detail brush with chipping and even some edge highlighting. Secondly, to add into the importance of the blue, all my unit standards get a little extra love when it comes to their banners. You don't really have to do this, of course, but if you pair it with the shields, these are the largest visual elements of your basic troops. We have only an old little saying about old army painting, which is faces and bases. Well, for these Tomb King skeletons, I would make a tweak and say shields and bases. Also note, to make an army painting easier, I highly recommend you paint the shields separately. It's much easier to get both the airbrush and the brush on both the skeleton and the shield when they aren't attached to each other, and you'll see why later in this video. I'll be painting skeletons in batches of 10 to start, and as I get more confident, I might start to increase that to possibly 20. Then go ahead and start doing the shields in the same batch manner. I keep the numbers low as not to burn myself out. It's a real skill and a test of endurance and patience to do huge batches at a time, and also a real feat to keep the quality up and consistent. So if this is your first army or you have a history of burning out and not finishing army projects, like I did in the past, there's no shame to starting small and working your way up. Just like lifting weights at the gym, you start light and as you get stronger, you increase the weight. Finally, when it comes to highlights, both with the brush and the airbrush, a general rule applies to these units. Focus your highlights on the model's chest and up. The main colors here are with the base, midtone, and highlight. The base is, well, your base. The midtone is over your base while leaving a little bit of space. And the highlights we focus at the very top. These models are all going to be standing shoulder to shoulder and pressed together in a tight formation. They would be naturally shading one another with the majority of the light always just at the top. Even if you're not painting skeletons, this rule can apply to any infantry formation in the old world, from dwarves to even the men-at-arms of Bretonnia. Okay, that's enough of the brief of this project. Let's get our models out and let's start laying down some paint. Let's get started. Okay, let's get started here. First off, I just gave a primer undercoat of Games Workshop's black through a rattle can. And right away, we're going to be starting off with the airbrush and using Tamiya's Hull Red. I really love Tamiya paint, especially through the airbrush in particular. When you thin this out, with Tamiya's X20A thinner. Make sure to get the A version because the regular X20 thinner is for their enamel paints, I believe, but the A at the very end stands for acrylic. So get that and running that through the airbrush. For all my airbrushing, I'm using Harder Steinbeck Evolution. I set that at around 28 psi. And the thinning of the paint is generally a 1-to-1. I like to work with thin airbrushed paint to really take advantage of the clean and the clean smooth application, and roughly doing around 2 layers. 2 thin layers is always better than 1 thick one. You'll get a better finish at the end. Next off is we use Citadel's Zandri Dust. Again, I will be putting this, since the pots are always kind of tricky with Games Workshop, you know, you don't get the dropper bottle, but besides that little thing, I'm just going to apply it into a dish. And I'm applying again, I'm thinning it down with more Tamiya X20A thinner. This thinner is awesome for GW paints. And, you know, you don't have to bother with their airline, which I don't even think they even sell. I never tried it. But a little, a word of note when you're using this X20A thinner with other paint brands, do a little test like you're doing in a Petri dish. Sometimes the X20A thinner, since it's, you know, it's an acrylic and alcohol based, some paints tend to gunk up and even like gel out. Some AK paints react to this stuff strangely, so just make sure just to give it a quick test if you're not using the GW Zandri Dust. So the first highlight we're going to be placing on top of the airbrush, again with the same settings, is we're applying it around like a 45-degree angle. I want to cover the majority of the model with this and just leaving just a hint of that hull red in the undercoat. And if you notice, I'm just going really, really thin and going softly across the entire model. Just making sure that when you're pushing down the trigger is you're never fully opening the airbrush. And that just goes for all airbrushing in general. What I'm doing is I'll never fully open the airbrush. I'm only trying just to get just enough paint just outside to get you a soft mark, and just going gently across the model. And make sure to keep that angle, that around that 45-degree angle downwards onto the model is your is a good way to highlight the model. If you start blasting from the underside, you'll start to lose this, you know, kind of like this zenithal effect. You know, just taking a tour and just doing a couple of thin, quick coats through the entire thing. When I see paint that builds up a little too wet, I stop painting on that area and move to another. The worst thing is you can have a lot of pooling if you don't allow areas to dry. The second layer is Ushabti bone. So the same thing, I'm just going to mix it in a dish like I did before, and I'll start applying a second degree of highlights. A good rule of thumb is when you're doing these second stage highlights and not to cover your entire first layer of work is 2 things. First off is make the angle of your airbrush steeper. So in the first layer, if you're doing around like a 45-degree angle, now I'm just going to get more steeper, so 70 degrees. And 2, just like in my in our introductory statement about where I'm placing the highlights, the majority of them I'm focusing these airbrush shots are on the head, the shoulders, the arm, and the chest. And depending on how the skeleton is standing, for instance, this guy, you know, has like that flexed knee kind of pose, maybe a little shot on his knee, and that's it. Along the back, especially since at the very vertical plane, holding the airbrush or tilting it down so it's shooting almost directly 90 degrees down will really help just nick the very, very top edges of each of the parts of the model, especially on the spine, and to not cover your previous layer, which would kind of defeat the highlight. And right here, this is just a good comparison shot between the two. So on the left is the completed highlighted skeleton bone, and on the right is the first one with just the Zandri dust applied. So So just to give you guys a good comparison shot to you guys feel where you guys are going in that direction. Hey, I would just like to take a second out of this tutorial to mention that I'm also on Patreon. If you enjoyed this video tutorial and would like to learn more in-depth techniques such as color theory, higher display model paintings, and more, consider joining me and becoming a Patreon, where this tutorial covers the rank and file skeletons that make up the tabletop army. The new dominating skeleton dragon released in the new Tomb King's army box set is a centerpiece, and that cannot be ignored, and of course deserves much more detail according to his rank and status. Watch and learn how I create the bone textures, highlighting placements, and contrasting gold NNM in this first part model series only available to Patreon tier subscribers. Of course, your support means here a lot on YouTube as well. So if you enjoyed the tutorial and found anything useful, I would really appreciate you liking this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and the important thing is to leave a comment, as that's the best way to let me know that you're enjoying the content and encourages me to make even more. Okay, I did my due diligence of the YouTube shoutout. Let's get back to what really matters, the painting. Now for probably the most important parts of the model, which is going to be the blue detail as well as the gold. So first off, I'm going to start with the blue, and this blue I'm starting off with scale 75s, Cantabric blue. I quite like this. I quite like these paints. I'm an old fan of scale 75, even though I haven't taken them out very often. You know, just getting used to other paints, but you know, this is a nice, comfortable paint that I'm coming back to in a nice, in that interesting scale 75, almost like a gel-like medium. This is only thinned a little bit here because I'm just giving a base coat. So I will probably thin with just a little bit of water just to get the paint to flow a little bit nicer along the brush, as I never like to paint with paint that's just taken straight out of the bottle. I always feel it just needs a little bit of water to get running, and we're just going to be doing some basic base coats. If your not all the skeletons have this headdress too. I don't think they have enough to cover the entire unit. So on the ones that don't, well, of course you're skipping this step, and those skeletons go even faster. But for the ones that have the headdress, which I really like, we're just going to start base coating around the entire area, around that headband. Don't worry if it gets on the lips, the trim of it, because we'll do that later in metallics, but it's just more important to get a nice solid coat for us to work off from. Next off, the highlights is going to be with Citadel Ahriman Blue, and I'm going to be doing some real easy and, you know, not the best looking highlights slash blends. But what I do here is I thin out the Ahriman Blue and I mix that up with just a little bit of Cantabric Blue, and I thin this paint around a 1-to-1, 1 part water to 1 part paint. And the most important thing about here is the brush direction that you are applying them. So in the direction, you want to be brushing in the direction towards the brightest part of the highlight, or rather where you want the most solid part of the color. So on that side strap that, you know, looks like giant sideburns, I'm going to be painting, I made the first brush strokes towards the front, and that just makes a little bit of a slightly softer transition, a really, you know, quick and dirty blend. If that is a little bit annoying, or you don't feel that, you know, you're getting the blend correct, or you just, you know, you got a lot of these skeletons to do, you can just go ahead and just edge highlight these. It's just to give a little bit of pop and a little bit of volume. Here's a good example. You can see how I'm brushing towards the front of the of that sideburn thing. And it just gets a little bit it just gets a bit of a softer edge toward the back. And, you know, we're not looking for any award-winning competition blending here. It's just making it look pretty effective. You know, we want to keep this to a tabletop and not drive ourselves crazy. When it comes to highlighting the band at the top, I don't even wrap the highlight all the way around. I want to keep all the highlights. I want to pull around and focus towards the front, much like a sphere. Next off, if you want to do a little extra bit of highlight, I just mix Ahriman blue and some white. Any white will really do, you know, it doesn't really matter. If you are a little more onto the finish and I want to keep to the GW finish, I pulled off this. I use white from Scale 75, their fantasy range, their fantasy and game range, which has a more satin finish, so similar to Games Workshop's more satin finish. But you know, that's a small little nitpicky detail. I just happened to have the paint at my desk and decided, hey, you know what, I'll just get a white that more matches the finish of Ahriman blue. After the blues are done, I have gone ahead and coated all the areas of metal with black, and then now I'm using Scale 75's Decayed metal. Big shout out to the boys at Celta Paint for getting me onto this Decayed metal. I'm never a huge fan of metallics. I don't paint a lot with metallics, but when I do, I was very fortunate to have Scale 75 send me a sample of all their metallic paints, and just steadily going through them and testing them all out, especially on these more recent army projects. And this Decayed metal was really awesome. I think it makes a great base for the gold I want to do for the army. So just taking your time and putting it into there. Just a word, especially since you're painting with metallics, a good thing to do is to, after you paint metallics, change your paint water. The worst thing is getting metallic flakes in your paint water, and then if you're going to go back and paint with regular acrylics, like we will later on when you get to the shields and such, the last thing you want to do is having like that metallic flake in your blue and other areas that are not supposed to be metallic. As well as if you only have one set of brushes, just take some brush soap and give them a quick clean after you do metallics, just to be sure on the safe side. But I mostly do my metallics with more worn out brushes that are not brand new. As for the details of the bandages you'll be using, I'll base coat everything scale with walnut by Scale 75. And like I said in the intro, you know, I always like to give a little bit of extra push and detail into the banners, and you know, this is going to be one of them. So for the base coats, you know, I'm just laying down, probably take around 2 layers to get a solid coat. Now, I think the biggest mistake that I always see a lot of people when they're doing like base coats, especially over black, is almost overworking the paint. Having the first layer go down and then applying the second layer like I'm doing here, I'm almost like, sometimes I find I'm kind of dabbing the paint on as just as much, not as much as like streaking it and pulling the paint across the entire surface. I always do the pull across on the first layer just to get some color down, and then the second one is a little more of a dab. And the same kind of dabbing motion I'm going to be doing here with the walnut mixed with pale sands from AK. And we're just going to apply them on the general highlights. For these volumetric highlights, you're looking, I'm just looking at the curve, the general like curve motion of the straps, and as the apex of the curve at the top here comes out and then it starts to fold backwards, that's where a shadow is going to be. If you're ever having issues with highlight placement, when we first prime the model black, that's actually a really good time to, you know, hold it under a lamp and you can see where the highlights hit. Especially with Games Workshop's black primer, it has a bit of, has a glossier finish to it, and that actually like really that really stands out and really helps you read the volume quickly. And it's never a bad idea if you're not entirely sure of the models that you're doing. You can always just take a picture of it and under the black primer, and you got a good visual reference. Here you can see that I've just laid down some highlights, as well as using the same value to start giving a bit of edge highlighting, just to punch out some of that detail. Same thing with like the general rule applies is when I'm doing these quick volume highlights, it's all about the brush direction, just like I said at the beginning of the where we were doing the blue on the head. Excuse me. And just to break up a little bit of the surface, this adding a little bit of lines, these like little dots, so like little cut lines, little dots throughout the entire project actually add a little bit of noise to your blends, so they don't have to be super smooth. But the nice thing is with these lines and little cuts, it adds a little bit of character, a little bit of like, kind of like weathering and stuff like that. But it also breaks up the surface, the visuals, the visual transition. So you can kind of hide not the most smoothest blends, which is totally fine. Here I'm going in with Rhinox Hide. Such an awesome color, really versatile. And for this, it just works as a nice shadow color for all your undead straps. If you notice, like even on the banner here, like I said, I always going to take a little bit extra time just with the banners because they're such large visual elements, and there's only one of them for each unit, so it's not punishing to do this across like 20 to 30 skeletons. A really simplified process for this is just base coating walnut. Doing a highlight with walnut mixed with that AK Pale Sands, and then shading, doing a simple black lining or like shadow lining with Rhinox Hide, and that's it. That's all you really need to do. But here I decided to just give you a little more of a detailed shot of what I would do on the Tomb King banners with these kind of parchment stuff. The same thing if you look at like the center cloth of the blue, it's literally the same process as the helmet and the same techniques I'm using here for these walnut banners, but just in blue. Now to keep it really simple, the staffs on here I just paint really basic with AK's Burnt Umber, nothing fancy. From Games Workshop, I really don't like it when they make the weapon staffs like super bright. I don't know why they do that. I think they just want to add more like visual color, and you're welcome to do that. I'm not saying it's like the wrong way to do it, but I find that highlighting an area and bringing a lot of attention to a part of a weapon that is extremely boring and doesn't in terms of a visual hierarchy, doesn't really do much. It's just the staff of the weapon. If anything, the most important part of the weapon is the pointy end, right? So yeah, that's why we're doing gold for the spear tips, but for the staffs, I don't give any like extra blue or anything like that. Keep it simple. It doesn't have to be, it just can be just any dark color. It could be like a really, really dark gray, or I just chose brown. Very neutral, easy. Now to spice up that gold, I use Vallejo metal, I'll call it gold. I really love this paint. It is like really nice, flows really smooth. You might notice it has quite it's much thinner off the brush compared to the scale 75's metallics, which are a lot thicker on the brush and on the paint. Especially with metallics, since they don't have like strongest coverage. If you thin them down, so this is like straight out of the pot. And just watch out with your charge with this paint because it does flow really thin. It also runs through the airbrush really, really well for other applications in the future. you know, because I don't think you're going to buy the paint just to paint Tomb King's spears and trim. But yeah, it's really formulated for the airbrush, but works just as well through the brush. Just make sure you don't overload your brush, because since it runs thinner, if you have too much in your brush, it will, like, you know, kind of pool out and would possibly cover up those details, especially when it gets around the headband of the warrior. You know, you don't want to do all that blue work and then just have it spewed out with a bunch of gold. Oops. But for the spears here, these spears, the model itself, the sculpt is not great. It's one of the flaws of the old the older skeleton sculpts. They're kind of rounded off, so I kind of just make up the sharpness by just where the cutting edge would be on the spear. That's where I paint gold, and I will leave a big blank empty spot of the decayed metal. Similar fashion of what the cloth is, where I just add little, you know, nooks, little scratch, little lines, and little like dots, just to break up the area, make it, just give the gold just a little bit of interest and texture on the spear, but nothing fancy. It's not like you have to do that. Again, I'm just showing you on another model, so this one doesn't have like a skull in the middle, but you can really see how this is very important, that I just gather the highlights on the front of the head and just a little touch in the back. Along the sides, so along the temple areas of the head, I will leave in that decayed metal. This will just help out the highlights to make the head look more round. And it's actually, if you look at it, it's a little less to paint. So you get a more three-dimensional, interesting look, and you have to paint a little bit less. That's a huge win-win in the army, and when you're looking at, you know, 100 skeletons or more, you know, depending what your army composition is, you're going to take every single little extra cheat and extra like little shortcut you can. For these characters that have a little bit of armor, the nice thing is it's a nice easy round shape, so just highlighting the top half crest of the circular shape will do. The odd little highlight band here. And yeah, there's supposed to be these, looks like straps, I bet most people think probably like some sort of leather strap or something to hold this together. But for the army, you know, I'm not going to bother to paint those, you know, paint that a different color. It's just going to get lost in the whole unit anyway. Like I said, the main parts of this army is really about that blue and that gold. So I'll just let those showcase, and you know, we'll sacrifice a certain amount of resolution in the army for the sake of horde army painting. I'd rather spend that time on, you know, maybe doing the tomb guard, which would warrant a little more decoration, or like the Ushabti and such. So, you know, pick your battles. That's what I say. And again, see, little bits of noise in there just makes it look a little more interesting. Sweet. So what I'm using here now is a mixture between Mephiston red and wow, I even wrote it on screen, but Bordeaux red. There we go. This red, I mixed these two colors together just because I found Mephiston red a little too strong in the red. Bordeaux red from AK is a little more desaturated, and I'm using this as a secondary spot color because I don't want it as pure and as strong as the blue. You know, I don't want them. I want the blue to be more dominant. So if there's little parts of the model that you want another splash of color, and I'll be using this as a secondary kind of trim color. You actually see the unit leader, the unit champion, on his shield. He has a little bit of extra accent with this red, and that's all I'm using as for a smaller a secondary accent. And this time I chose to just write the Sanskrit on these, on the banner. You know, I'm not going to take a huge amount of time doing the freehand. Just doing some simple, yeah, I just searched up some Sanskrit um, pages off of Pinterest. I use that a lot just to find images. I'm not going to be, I don't want to be doing the hieroglyphs on the main units because that is like the language of the gods from ancient Egypt. And only the most important people will get the hieroglyphics. For everyone else, like these dudes here, they'll get some Sanskrit. And I'm not looking to be totally accurate either. You just need to get some stuff down on there. So with your patience of painting the entire model, now I can go ahead and give it the entire model a gloss varnish. I use gloss varnish from AK's 3rd generation acrylics, but any polyurethane gloss varnish will do. Just spraying that through the airbrush and let that fully dry. Now to give our bases a little bit extra love, I'm just using this stuff by Scale 75, the Soilworks. I like this Mars pattern. I really like the color that it comes in, and it just, it's colored there just for us to skip a step. If you just have acrylic paste that is neutral, you can always paint that paste after, or rather, if you have like a neutral colored paste, you can actually put your own pigments in there and give it a good mixture. But the stuff I have from Scale 75 is already colored, and I think it'd be really good, a continuation color for my Tomb Kings, since, we're using Hull Red and a lot of, just a lot of, more warmer tones into here. This sand, this will give a good base color for the ground, as we will apply pigments on afterwards. Being careful not try to like cover the entire foot. If stuff gets on the feet, who cares? It's in the sand. I'm just making sure I don't want to like overlap the entire foot with this stuff. The other thing I just make sure of is that, just kind of moving the grit around. There's areas that are going to be less, less of the acrylic grit in there, and that's fine. If it gets on the base edges, I just use my finger and just give it a quick wipe off. I'm not so worried about the red color on the side of the trim because we'll paint over that, but I just want to make sure that I don't have any leftover grit on the side because I'd rather have the frames of the base look nice and clean. Because it is a frame, makes the model look that much nicer when it's not dirtied up on the sides. All right, time for the real flavor game. So AK's Wargame washes, dark rust wash, and then they also have the fruit scented thinner. This is what I mean by you need a couple of these cups, because it's just so much easier to pour a little bit out and then you can thin it. I generally don't like using the washes like straight out of the pot. I always like to give it a little bit of thinner, because I'd rather apply a couple of thin coats. Just in case, maybe it's too thick and then you spend more time rubbing it off or like moving it off. But keep in mind, this is going to be an enamel rather than an oil wash. They both get thinned very similarly, and you can also manipulate an enamel by removing excess as you would with oils. But the nice thing is with enamels is they dry a lot faster. So you won't have like those hour or two working times as you would with oils, but I just want to apply this wash all the way through to here, covering everything on the model, and that gloss varnish really helps break the surface tension, so my wash really gets into all the crevices and shades everything, as well as over the flat surfaced areas. It leaves just a bit of a skim coat, a nice little filter. So it's gonna, it's gonna tint all that bone back to a little more of that reddish orange, which I really want. And yeah, even going over the blue. The other dish that I have on the side is just a dish of just pure thinner. So after I'm gonna be, going through the entire model, the one thing we're going to be doing is protecting a bit of our highlights, and protecting a little bit of the color. I still want this wash, of course, to go over the blue. It's going to tint the blue a little bit and bring all the colors, the entire model is going to come together a little bit closer, a little more homogenized with this wash. But if you notice that if you get there's too much of this wash across the blue, we can just start pulling some of it off by a series of rinsing your brush clean with the thinner, dabbing it on a paper towel so your your brush is not like soaking wet of thinner. It's more just like softly damp, and then you can start pulling off, rubbing off the wash where you want to remove it, mainly again in the highlights. The other areas that I like to remove it is on the head, as I'm doing here. So I have a pretty much like almost a dry brush there. So just gently removing the excess off on those areas. Now with the pigments, I'm going to make a pigment wash. I like making pigment washes just because it makes the area a little bit cleaner when you're working with pigments. It can get quite a bit all kind of messy, but if you just mix pigments with some water and mix them in a tin, you'll make like this this liquidy pigment type of paste. I'm gonna add a little bit more into there just to make it a bit thinner. So around that thinness, it's really hard to describe. It's more like just the look. The nice thing is when you apply this pigment as a wash, it goes on like this, and you might not think like, oh, what the fuck is going on with this stuff. But the nice thing is when the water evaporates, it just leaves the pigment, and the pigment will look a lot drier. Now, again, like when the look of this pigment looks a lot darker too. But if you check out the original color of the pigment, it's a lot lighter. And when it's all dried, you can also use a hair dryer to help you out if you're, a little pressed for time. That's what it looks like when it's dry. So yeah. And some models, I might have missed a little bit of patchiness or want to move things around. But the nice thing is that I can just get a scrap brush and just start massaging it and just pushing it into the areas to make it a little more unified across the ground. Or maybe you applied your wash a little bit too thick and you want to remove some. It's always good to do, like, you could always do like one test model, let that dry, and then see how well your mix of your wash is, and you can just adjust the dilution accordingly. After that, I'm using a matte varnish by MIG. This matte varnish is quite interesting because it has a little bit of a shine to it, and I quite like that actually. It's not like as matte as you would say AK's Ultra Matte, which more on that a little bit later, but I'm just going to give the entire model a matte varnish. The one thing I did with my airbrush settings is I lowered it down to 18 psi just so I don't just blow all of the pigment away. But the nice thing is I even hit the pigment, and when this is all dry, it acts as an anchor and will hold it in place. Now to the shields. This is why I paint them separately, because we can just use our airbrush to really help us bang these out and not get this gray primer all over the place. I use gray primer just because I want a more vibrant blue to come off of, and it's just a lot easier to get the base coats down on a gray primer. Any gray primer will do, but I did use AK's gray primer through the airbrush. And the same colors that we originally applied with our blue on the skeleton are also, of course, going on the shield. So Cantabric blue, you can see how I'm doing the first pass. I'm just getting some paint on here. I'm not worried about complete coverage. This is again how I can get a nice soft and unified finish through my airbrushing, instead of rushing and trying to nail the entire coat on the first pass. Allowing a couple of two passes to go through will just leads you to a lot nicer finish in the end. And make sure, don't forget to get the edges of the models too, on the left and the right sides, which sometimes I forget. And then you're like, oh man, got to go back there with like a brush again, and kind of annoying. But even mounting, I've just mounted these my shields on this this cork, and then there's just a piece of blue tack pretty much right where the handle of where the skeleton hand's supposed to go in anyway, so I think it holds it quite nicely. And just doing a couple of tours. Again, Citadel Ahriman Blue will be our the next highlight into the airbrush, and this is actually a good demo here of how soft I like to use the airbrush. So when you're letting air through, I'm pulling the needle back very slowly on the trigger. And right when I start to see a ghost of the image like that soft mark, that's it. That's how far I like to open up the airbrush. I don't open it up anymore. And this way you get a very, very soft application, and you can see the paint build up nice and evenly. You know, you're not surprised by this big sudden jerk of a ton of paint coming out. And if you need anytime if you feel, even if your hands are kind of cold in the day, or especially if it's like the first thing you're painting, you're going on with the airbrush, it just pays to do a couple of test shots, get a little bit warmed up, and finding that point in the airbrush where paint just starts to come out in that fashion, as well as thinning out that paint. It really the X28 thinner is awesome with this GW paint. And mixing to at least like a 1-to-1. I love airbrushing with thinner paints, because you get such a nice smoother result, and that X28 thinner really helps thin out and evenly distribute the pigment, especially on Games Workshop paints. So as you can see with the highlights here that I'm applying, I apply it at the top of the shield and straight down the middle, just to show off a little bit of the shield that has that curve, that cylindrical curve, that goes a long way to helping illustrate the shape. Now, if you have some extra, I poured too much Ahriman Blue, so I just put a little bit of white straight from the pot into there and just made a highlight mix. And then, of course, added a little bit more thinner into my airbrush, just to even out the ratio. And again, the nice thing is, by airbrushing really, really thin, you can slowly build those highlights to a level that you need it. And this time, these highlights, the only place I'm going to be putting them is at the top. I'm not going to be running this highlight down the center like I did in the last layer. This just brings a little more light to the top. Quite nice. Actually, I really enjoy painting the shields in Warhammer Fantasy. I think that's one of the biggest highlights with a lot of these rank files is, just having this big rank of shields in front of you, good decoration, and it just really looks like a solid bulwark of strong warriors, or in this case, Bordeaux skeletons. But hey, you can raise them, right? Yeah. And here, even with another note when you're doing these highlights, especially on these upper areas, is I'm also just looking at how wet the area is. So as soon as it starts to get shiny and wet, I just leave it and go do the next one, because that's the easiest way that you can over highlight something with the airbrush, is you're judging too much on what the area looks like wet, but we really want to know how it changes when it dries. So doing a little shot and observing, and then making adjustments as you go along. Now for the metallics, it's the same actually sequence as we did the skeleton warriors. So first off, I went through and painted this all black as a primer for the metallics. It's probably the most tedious part of the entire painting, or the entire process, and it's also, to me, it's the most boring, because it's just, taking black. But this extra stage of laying down black before you put down your gold, I think just helps, definitely helps in the metallic finish, not only for the colors, but also to, keeping the paint finish nice and thin and vibrant. I think you can, if you on a real pinch, I think you can get away with just putting the decayed metal straight on top of without doing the black. But the nice thing is with the black, you also get some like good natural shading as well if you don't, not going to go totally accurate with your metallics. So it's really a choice, but I think it really pays off because I can get nice, thin, even distribution of the metallic paint. And also metallics also, I think, look better when they're done over a black base coat. As for the gold that I'm using here, it's the same VMC gold. Again, focusing the highlights at the very, very top and focusing it on the arch. So when any of those panels go down into a vertical plane, I don't touch them. I just get the the top curvature and then do an edge highlight. The inner edge highlight, the one that's on the inside, that's like bonus land if you want to do them. I'll paint it in. I don't think it's too much of an issue. But if there's one edge highlight that you can miss, that's the one. That's the least important one on the shield. I really like these rounded, I don't know what they're called, nubbins, but they're really easy to make look good and effective. So just putting the gold and just focusing more of the highlight on the top half of that little circle really make them look more rounded. Now for the chips. Hell yeah. So like I said in the introduction, if there's anything we're going to spend a little bit extra time on, it's going to be the shields because they just take up so much of the space. So by getting Rhinox hide and mixing it in with a little bit of black, you can skip the black if you really want to. You can just do Rhinox hide. We're just going to be applying some chips, and I'm applying them by brush. I just enjoy doing that. So focusing and doing, making areas of the edges of the shields worn out. I try to leave like just little gaps in between the edges, not just smear all of it along, because I want a little bit of like when we highlight the blue to kind of poke out and to look a little bit irregular. But for the horizontal chips that run, or these markings that run across, it's just like a series of, it's almost like Morse code that you're doing on your shield, like dots and dashes. And the best thing to do is, of course, get your detail brush out. So I'm using my Artis Opus number 2, or sorry, 00, not number 2, 00. My favorite detail brush. It works great. I'll thin this paint again. So this Rhinox hide is almost 1-to-1. 1 part water, 1 part paint. A little bit less than that. A little more on the paint side. And you can see how I'm just using just working the very tip of the brush. And just trying to keep one of the best pieces of advice is just try to keep a very light hand when you do across these. You almost want to, I like to make a note, is you're almost trying to tickle the surface of the model with the tip of your brush. And sometimes you won't get a mark because you'll be focusing on such a light touch that you don't, but that's okay. It's kind of like this, just natural little bits of skipping in between. And again, it's just little dots and dashes, and trying to complete a line going from like left to right. And of course, give yourself some variation. Not everything has to be at the same degree or angle. Switching it up by I mostly like moving the area around. Now for other highlights, so this is Ahriman blue mixed with some white, and I am doing some edge highlights, so some nicks along the edges, as well as I am doing the undersides of several of these chips. This part of the highlight is also a great way to correct any chips that you did that are really big. So if you did like an accidental big oops, a big monsters one with the Rhinox hide, you can actually take this color and cut over that highlight and actually reduce the size of it just by by a little bit. So that might be a little bit of a way to correct it if you made it too large. But at the same time, there's a lot of these shields, and there's going to be shields that look good, and then there's going to be shields you might not be so proud of. When you put these together, or when you plate them on your model, put the good shields on the front, or at least take the ones that are best, give them to your command, and then the one or two models you think that look the best, maybe even putting like maybe a little dot sticker at the bottom of the base to tell you which ones are the best or something. And then you put the crappier ones in the back ranks. No one's gonna know. You are gonna make mistakes. I think there's some shields here I'm like, I could have done better, but I put those ones, the uglier ones, in the back. Good ones in the front. There's a lot of them to go around, so it's more of like a big numbers game, so don't stress out too much. Even with like the brown chipping, if you really wanted to, you could probably even use a sponge, but maybe I will show that in another video in the future. Or I think you can actually check that out from, I think, my old Sons of Horus paint job from Horus Heresy. That one, it's in my it's on my YouTube playlist. All right, so the other thing, of course, we're going to give that a wash, because everything gets this unified wash from the enamel AK wash, that dark rust wash. So I applied it over the entire shield, and now I'm just showing you the cleaning process. So I'm just removing some of this stuff. So just with a brush that is clean and dry, just with a little bit of thinner that is kind of like damp in there, I am going over the highlighted areas like you see there. See, I just there, and I'm pulling, and I'm always pulling pretty much downwards. And this just gives a little bit an irregular edge. It just gives a little bit of movement. You don't really see too much of it, but you can still see how I protected the majority of the highlights because I don't want those erased too strong. And the nice thing is that over that gloss varnish, it matted it out pretty well. The back of the shields is nothing special. I am using some of that deep shade stuff from AK. I believe this is Crime, and I'm just going over the entire backside. Even though there's like that detail of the shield, blue shield skin that being pulled over and singed in the spot, I don't care. You can just use contrast paint or something. No one really looks at the back of those shields anyway. It's just to cover up that area a little bit. After gluing it on, you can see me now. Now I'm just taking pigments, and another way to work with it is I just put it in a tin here, and I'm just taking a really crappy brush and just, slotting it in there and just patting it down. Again, with little pulls down to the base of it, just to give a little bit of sand and some texture into there. And then finally, to seal that all up, and last sealant of here is the AK Ultra Matte. Again, when you're using this with the airbrush, lower down your PSI to around 18 so you don't blow away too strongly. And I'm just going to coat the entire, I'm going to do a layer of that on the base as well as the lower part of the shield. Doing your best not to aim it into the upper parts, into the highlights, in particular to hit the gold and metallic, because we don't want to matte out that too much. And with that final stage of the Ultra Matte varnish, you can put them all together, rank them up, and you're done. Thanks again for joining me on this Tomb Kings tutorial. I'm really excited to be sharing some more army painting with you guys, especially for a game that I'm just really enthusiastic and really hyped on. And, really happy to come back into this world and to be playing with some really old friends and, we're just enjoying the old world as a whole. Thanks again. And if you are interested, like I said before, if you want more display and more highly detailed painting, breakdown of more advanced techniques through various forms of blending, color, composition, all that great stuff. Please consider following and joining my Patreon, where you guys can join in and view over 100+ hours of video tutorials in all that classic long format that I really like to show off. So you guys get to see every single, all the main strokes and all the main color mixes and everything that goes into the creation of these projects. Other than that, I really hope to see you guys on Instagram and Facebook or social medias. I'd really love to see your own Tomb Kings, and if you do use this tutorial, please give me a shout out. I'd love to see what you do with it, what colors you choose, and how you followed and your interpretation of your own Tomb Kings and your own armies, etc. Thanks again, and we will see you in the next one. Happy painting.